Let me just begin by introducing myself. My name is Akiva Levy. I'm here with 613 Design. I must apologize, I don't speak Hebrew very well. I moved here recently, so you're going to have to put up with English. I've been asked to speak about CSS3, some of the new functions and modules that it's incorporated. So just to give a brief overview, first we're going to just discuss what those modules are going to be. Talk about some of the shortcomings that some people may feel they have. I'm going to showcase some of the actual modules and work. Not all of them, there's plenty. We're going to give a working demonstration of a little page I just created rather quickly. Give some, basically give some experience or so an example of how to do it in a progressive enhancement way so that even people who are using other browsers, let's say Internet Explorer, will still get a chance to see something that doesn't look a complete mess. And then I'm just going to show some more advanced examples in the wild that some people have been sort of tinkering with out there, and see a bit of what CSS3 is really capable of doing. So I don't know how much. Well, let me just begin first of all. How many of you are actually web designers? Okay, a good number. And how many of you would consider yourselves? How many of you would consider yourselves web developers? Okay. How many graphic designers? No? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Slowly. Okay. How many of you would consider yourselves multiple category, sort of weird, vague group? A few. Okay. I myself like to look at the term web developer as someone who does not just back-end server-side, programming, but sort of someone who has at least some knowledge in all of the fields. I do very strongly believe that people who are very adamantly involved and very much engrossed in the progress of web technologies is at least fairly well versed in many different technologies, even if it's not their specialty. So just to, I guess, jump ahead here, I assume everyone here has a fairly basic knowledge of CSS at least, yes? Good, good, no baby steps? Okay, so CSS1 was introduced by the W3C in December 1996. It's important to note that CSS was originally not at all created for the purpose that it is now. When it was created in 1996, everyone was still creating websites using tables. Some people somehow still are today, but the actual spec was mostly for styling some simple elements, headers, fonts, colors, really basic things. Not really anything to do with positioning so much. I believe there was float. If anyone can confirm, not even float? I thought there was float. No? Okay. Moving on. 2 years later, CSS2 came out, which was leaps and bounds, much, much better. And by this point, people have started to create the ideology of what is the web stack. Basically, we have HTML for content. We have JavaScript for behavior, whatever some people might term that to be. And we had CSS, which was meant to be the presentation. Basically, the styling, the visual effects, the visual appearance of your website, which was great. It tried to break people out of using tables. This was in 1998. I think people were still doing this in 2008 with tables, but it was still there. 2 years after this, CSS3 was first introduced as a working draft. Hard to believe, that was 10 years ago, but it was first introduced then. However, 2 years after that, we went right back to CSS 2.1. Now, there's a few reasons for this. CSS 2.1 was, once again, improving upon CSS 2. CSS3 was more or less forgotten, which might have been a good thing. So, wondering how it could possibly be 10 years old, we have to look into the history of it. First of all, W3C has, up until now, developed all of their specifications as a huge monolithic entity. Basically, everything was created at once, and it meant that things took a little while. Now, we saw that everything was sort of going by in 2-year spans, which is great. 10 years later, we're looking at CSS3 now, and I'm giving a talk about it. But as we see here, browser support was weak. even for CSS level 2, 2.1 as well. Even now, there are some browsers, I'm not going to name names, which are still not so great. But I think more importantly than the browser support was the understanding or the maturity of the people behind these websites that were supposed to be using these technologies. Basically, a browser is going to be forced to give in to demand. And the truth is that until recently, maybe even 2005, really a mass understanding of the web stack and people taking things seriously with web standards, certain individuals coming out, we have Mayer, Zeldman, to name a few. Really, a lot of people just didn't understand it. A lot of people felt like creating a website was just opening up Photoshop, creating something that looks really nice, slicing it up to a million pieces, and then just pasting it into a table. So what happens was, now that progress has been made by both browsers and the people behind these websites and whatnot, the CSS3 was once again sort of reignited. Now, to make headway, it was broken up into modules, which was a rather interesting move. Now, basically, since we have these modules, what's happened is that the actual specification has been sort of targeted as what are the main categories or areas of what we want CSS to do, and who's going to take responsibility to do them. People could put forth ideas, and it was up to them to basically maintain it, and if no one had any interest, they would kind of die. Now, basically, this decision has pros and cons. First of all, just to talk about the pros, the first and most obvious thing is the fact that we have a much quicker development time. We have people almost around the clock working on various modules, usually the modules that pertain to them in their field of interest. And since they're developed independently from one another, we have no need to wait for another module to be completed before someone else is able to make progress in a different field or different module. And briefly stated already, since we have the ability to target specific needs, we have new things being introduced. We have modules for instance, oral browsers. Not a lot of progress being made there, but we have that, which will help accessibility plenty. And sorry, by oral browsers, what I mean is looking at other browsers that say they're supposed to have speech that can talk to you to say what the certain content area is supposed to tell you, and we can specify how that's done. Now the cons, as much as I would love to say I was a CSS3 evangelist and there's anything wrong with it, there are a few things that are still being worked out, and it is still rather new. So due to the various modules and the different teams being basically in charge of working on them, we're getting some areas, we're seeing some fuzzy progress or fragmentation. I'm going to touch upon that in a little bit, but it's important to remember that right now CSS3 is still not complete. Certain modules are complete and have been approved, but not many. Most of them have not been. And it's also important to just keep in mind the web stack. So does everybody understand what I mean by saying the web stack? No? Okay. If you have a website, and I think some people sort of touched upon this before myself here, if you have a website and you have, let's say, a paragraph or a div, we're seeing a lot of people doing divitis, basically using divs to replace tables. Now, really, a div is supposed to mean something. It's just supposed to mean a certain block. It's really abstract, and it's important to be abstract. But let's say we have a paragraph. A really simple example is basically saying we shouldn't be doing. Okay, let me give you a better example than a paragraph. A header. If we have a header, basically, presentation is supposed to mean that what you see is showing basically the presentation of it, the CSS. So if we have a header using an image, referring back to the Photoshop slicing, someone cutting up an image that they really like the font of and just basically pasting it in there, when you look at the HTML, the code behind that page, what it's saying is nothing. You have no idea. You're seeing the source code, and what it says is image source blah, 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 blah. And you have no idea what that means. What we should be doing is something like a header 1 tag, and then using CSS to offset the text, maybe put in a background image, do some more advanced features like this. This is important for a few reasons besides just being very anal and picky, is that for accessibility, someone's using a screen reader. When it comes to an image, the screen reader doesn't know what to do with it. if you have an alt text or whatever, you know, it still does something. However, it's still not appropriate. We're seeing this now, not just in areas where, let's say, accessibility is concerned, because let's face it, many people didn't care about accessibility. Everyone sort of has the view of, I'm okay, so who cares? The truth is that now we have things like iPhones and more advanced mobile browsers. We have big concerns about search engine optimization. All of these things really do take account there. Basically, you should be able to look at a web page without any CSS whatsoever, without any images, and it should still make sense. Maybe not the prettiest, but it should still make sense. So keeping that in mind, that's the presentation layer, that's the CSS. Now, obviously the HTML is the content we were just talking about. The behavior part of the stack, this is the JavaScript. This becomes, depends how advanced you want to be, but it's supposed to be very much so that any interaction a user might do with your website, whether it's clicking a checkbox and you want some sort of styling, maybe when someone moves their mouse over an element, it shakes or does some little animation. This is behavior. This has nothing to do with presentation, even though you're visually seeing it, but it's the behavior because that is depending on someone interacting with it. Now, this was basically what was in place up until CSS3. Very many people were okay with this idea, the three element paradigm of this web stack. So to move on, as I said, that was just a side note, but to move on, understanding the problems with CSS, it's really easy to get excited. We're making a lot of progress, we're doing a lot of really great things. There are still some outstanding issues that a lot of people are very, very pained to see. For instance, when you're styling something with CSS, you can style it by, let's say, using attributes. You can select something using attribute selectors. So you can say that any paragraph that is the child of a header should have, let's say, one EM indent. And this is great. This makes sense. The problem is that if you want to do something reverse, if you want to go up the DOM tree, you can't. You're stuck. And so then you end up using something like jQuery, which is wonderful and fantastic. I love jQuery. But a lot of the focus on jQuery has been, I think, due to the fact that traversing the DOM is extremely easy. And that really shouldn't be the job of JavaScript. That should be native right within CSS. Another problem, as we see here, that a lot of people have been worrying about or wondering when it's finally going to come, is getting some math or calculations and expressions, basically saying, if the window is this big, we should be able to make this, let's say, 50% of this other element's width. Calculations like this, not present at all. Also, vertical control, still not there. There's many, many hacks, many people trying to find out other ways to simply position something in the middle of the window, but there's no real simple built-in solution. As I mentioned already, many of these modules have not yet reached the officially recommended status, which is going to obviously create some hesitation for many people due to, I think, a lot of misunderstanding. So to further explain the shortcomings, I really wanted to get this out to begin with, to let everyone down that CSS3 is nothing great. No, it is. Basically, the truth is that besides the ideas that a lot of people have put forth about what is still lacking in CSS as it is, there are still some other options, or still some other issues here. Basically, besides all of the positioning, ascending the DOM, obviously this is the big one. Browser support can be flaky. And it still can be, and it probably will stay that way. I would like to point out that one of the biggest offenders of this has gone through like 4 revisions in 3 years or 4 years. So I think by the time that, let's say, IE12 is out, everything should be great. Which, at this pace, will probably be next year. Which is a good thing, because it means that they're seeing that there's real problems and they're taking it seriously. I mean, IE7 was out, what, 1 year, and the next year, IE8, I think? Yeah? So it's, you know, it sounds funny, but it's a good thing.
Someone mentioned that the best solution to IE8 was Microsoft actually choose website as the rendering engine and solve every problem.
I don't think that's going to happen, though. But yes, that would be nice. or just dropping IE altogether, just focusing on an operating system. Maybe get rid of some of those blue screens of death. Okay, so moving on. Not supposed to show any bias. Moving on, since we have the multiple groups working on modules, we can say vendors instead of groups or parties. Let's give an example with WebKit versus Gecko. The problem is that when two parties are both developing something that has not yet been approved, they create what's called a prefix. Okay, so when you want to style an element using their newly proposed CSS implementations of whatever module, oftentimes you're going to see, more than not, you're going to see a prefix that specifies which browser this is supposed to be aimed for. Now, in logic, this is very sensible, because until something is stable, we really should not be just assuming everyone's going to render it the same way. We do get into some fragmentation here where multiple browsers render certain things the exact same way, and no one's choosing to drop the prefix, and it's becoming very complicated to do something quite simple. So all of the negative things being said, can we use it? Yes, we most emphatically can use it. We should use it, and it is extremely important, not only for ourselves, but basically for the whole entire internet as a people. Basically, you just need to use common sense. You need to proceed with caution. You need to know what you can and cannot do, and you need to always assume that maybe someone else isn't as savvy as you. They're not using the most recent version of Firefox, or maybe they're using Netscape Navigator. Basically, we're going to be employing progressive enhancement, which I understand was already discussed today. And so who says we can use it? Basically, almost anyone of importance. You might notice that two of those people actually are using the same engine, but we're not going to focus on that. Even Microsoft says we can use it. They've already offered their prefix, which is M. I haven't really seen it being used yet, because I don't know if anyone cares that much. But, pardon me?
Why using this prefix? Why not using the double receipt?
Right. I'm going to show an example of that coming up. I don't mean to get ahead of myself too much, but just to give you a very brief example, there's a text shadow. Okay, text shadow is one of the new options we can do with CSS3. So this isn't really the case at the moment. No one's really using a prefix for text shadow. But let's say when there was first discussions of text shadow, both, let's say, Opera and Mozilla, they weren't really on the same page as to how it should be implemented. So rather than just specifying in CSS saying box or text shadow this, the problem would be is that as a developer or as a designer, or whatever term you want to use, graphic designer, web person, you don't know how it's going to work because you're using the same term. It's like saying margin. I mean, margin has been assumed to be used in one particular way, and that's it. So it makes sense very much in that way. It's great that people are introducing these prefixes as opposed to just waiting for their browsers to slowly die and crumble, that they're trying to be progressive and they're trying to be proactive. So we're going to review some of the modules that I've been talking about. As we can see with the blurb here, basically some of them, and a lot of the focus on CSS3 has been on the new visual features, which is great. I don't even know if that's really the most powerful in my opinion, but it is very good, obviously. One of the things we can do natively now is do rounded borders. We can do drop shadows on text, on boxes. We have new ways of targeting elements using new selectors, which is also incredibly powerful. We're going to take a look at some of those right now. So as I mentioned with the browser prefixes, we have here just an example. So we have for Mozilla, Camino, etc., Opera, WebKit for Safari and Chrome. Now, Microsoft has MS. I've not seen this one being used. I'm used to seeing filter, which is dreadful and no one should ever use it, but it's an option out there. MS, I assume, is going to be used a lot more with 9 once it's released, and Conqueror is KHTML. The reason why I mentioned Conqueror is that I'm personally a big Linux user, but also more importantly for why it should matter to you is that Conqueror, for anyone who might be interested, has actually recently, I think, been declared the most CSS3 and HTML5 friendly browser of all of them. It always has been? Oh, okay. You're a Linux user?
These are the two
do Concord users?
I actually don't use Concord because I didn't care much for the KDE GUI, but it's obviously an incredibly powerful, engine. Not that we can't even see the whole text here, unfortunately. However, I do have, for anyone who might be interested, and I can always give this out later on, there's an excellent article here about the fragmentation I was talking about and why it's a bad thing. Basically, at Quirks mode, the author goes on to show how some of these things are now clashing with one another by using these prefixes. For instance, we do see that in some places, while WebKit generally uses WebKit, there are some places where, if I remember correctly, KHTML works, because KHTML actually was originally used for WebKit, and WebKit branched out from them. Not that that sounds that important, but the point is that you're going to start seeing, if you want to create a drop shadow, you now need to think, I need to do drop shadow for Moz, O, WebKit, MS, KHTML, whatever ones. And really, in the next short while, something native would be the solution. And we're now going to have all of these other options, which may or may not hang around for quite a while, and it can be, obviously, needless clutter. We have some new color modules, which are great. We have here, you can't see whatsoever on the slide, my presentation here actually has a bit more color. See, there's also a header, that color, that's not supposed to be almost black. But in any case, most people have been specifying their colors for, I don't know, ages now using RGB. There are some other options. I hope no one's using the color keywords anymore like aqua, but in any case, with RGB, we now have a fourth option if we specify using RGBA, and that is, of course, as you see here, going to be a number between 0 and 1, which allows us to select an opacity, or basically the transparency, the alpha transparency of that color. We now have HSL as an alternative for keywords and RGB, which is basically now, as we see here, I'm sorry, and the other option is hexadecimal. That's the one most people would be using, I assume. HSL, however, is, I suspect not too many people will use it, but it is still good, it's still useful. Basically, it stands for hue, saturation, and lightness. The hue is going to be a point on a color wheel, if you remember those. And we can specify color by choosing any point, and then getting to specify from there further its saturation and its lightness. I really don't know too many people who are that excited about it, but I could be wrong there. And likewise as well, just like with RGBA, we now have HSLA, which is the exact same thing. We get to choose, once again, a fourth argument, which is going to be 0 through 1 for the opacity. 0 being completely transparent, 1 being fully opaque. I'm sorry, I really missed this here. If I just go back, that's an excellent point to bring up. If you see in the top corner, I tried to specify the browser support. So you're often going to see Internet Explorer kind of faint. That means there's not really any support. Some of the items have a little bit of a flaky support there, so for the sake of ease, I just made it out. So almost everyone's supporting RGBA. Almost everyone's supporting HSL. I believe IE91 said they're going to support all of these different colors. And HSLA as well, IE is still missing from the gang. Moving on to backgrounds, which is probably a bit more exciting for some people. We can now choose multiple backgrounds. So this is great because, as I mentioned, we're supposed to have an HTML, a web stack. And everything we put in HTML should mean something. If it means nothing, it shouldn't be there. So we see divitis a lot, which is when people just have a number of useless and needless divs. Of course, they look useless and meaningless, but however, they're being used as hooks for CSS or even sometimes for JavaScript. So sometimes we do it because we need to have, let's say, each one of these 3 items showing up together, and there's really no way with CSS2. We now have multiple backgrounds with CSS3, and as you can see, by basically doing everything we've already been doing for background, but simply including a comma, we can do an endless amount of other backgrounds. Once again, the support is for everyone else but one. Yeah? Okay. I'm sorry, maybe this is, I guess, rather interesting. What you're seeing right now, this isn't actually using any sort of presentation software. This is using Eric Mayer's S5 system. This is all on a website right now. I can open up the source to what you're seeing. So this is just showing that this is a working example. For anyone curious, I'm actually running this right now through Opera. So you're actually looking at an actual div here, and this will be the according code. And if anyone's interested in talking about S5 later on, I'd be more than happy to. This was a great example for me to try it. And basically, I just marked everything up in an HTML file, and with some JavaScript, it creates a full-page presentation. And it's free. And it's not Microsoft. OK, so showcase backgrounds. We have gradients, which is wonderful. I would advise probably not doing rainbows, but just for the sake of showing it, we can now choose right in the browser to have backgrounds. It's good to always call beforehand a default solid color for browsers who obviously don't have it, just like we do with progressive enhancement. But for anyone who any browser that does support it, right now you can see there's only 2 major browsers. You'll see it. Now this is a good example here of what I was talking to you about earlier with the fragmentation, but the need for having prefixes. This is a great example. Right now, it's not specified an absolute way of doing it. So we have Mozilla's interpretation, which looks fairly straightforward. Yeah, I'm sorry. Because Google Chrome is actually using the WebKit, I'm just, yeah. I probably could have filled up the whole top with different ones, Camino and Flock, but I'm just going to, for the sake of ease, just show the 4 main browsers there and the rendering engines. So we have here basically a fairly simple way of showing how to do 3 colors. This is supposed to be a blue, this is supposed to be a red, and this is yellow. The way we do it with Mozilla is, once you get the hang of it, fairly sensible. And when you look at the WebKit way of doing it, it becomes a little bit more bizarre. But they have all rights to do it this way because right now there isn't really anything that's been finally proposed as to how to do it. I'm only showing you some of the new selectors and some of the new styles and features of CSS3, as mentioned at the beginning of my talk. But I should just point out that along with the linear background gradients, which you're seeing here, there are other ones. There's there's radial, which is unique for, let's say, doing some sort of, I don't know, sunburst. Donuts? Sure. You can. Now, I didn't show it here because it probably would have taken up the whole page on how to do it in WebKit because it's really, really intense. But for the average user, let's just stay away from it. But the point is that there is one for radio. And after the talk, you can take a look online. You can see some examples. I don't know of anyone who's using it now on a website because obviously you can use a gradient very subtly on an element just for a little added pizzazz. But if you're going to do something this far, you probably want to use an image. Because for anyone who can't use it, that's 3 colors. It's pretty important. For something really subtle, you can probably just not worry about it. Someone will see a solid color if you specify the solid color beforehand. The problem with the radial gradient is that it's pretty important. It's a visual element that's usually quite noticeable. And so I don't think there's too many people focusing on it. And in fact, if I remember correctly, right now WebKit is the only person who is offering a radial one. Even though Moz specifies Moz linear, I don't think I've seen Moz radial. But I could be wrong.
This is running in Opera, so this is an image?
No, this is actually the HTML. If I just minimize it, you can see here.
So Opera does support Chrome.
I'm sorry. Yes, it's Chrome. OK, so I'm just going to move on to another area here. Borders. I don't know if you can see that. It's not supposed to look silvery, but it's blue. From here, it looks a bit like a mirror. We have the ability to specify the border. Now, most people have come to accept that the border is going to be only one argument, the actual radius you want to use. You can use pixels, or you can use EMs. However, the actual specification allows for 2 arguments, but I don't know if too many people are using it. And you can actually choose the curve in which it comes in. It's not used too often, and so I believe what's going to end up being adopted is something like we see here with WebKit and Moz. But this is still another great example of how they're doing the exact same thing. And so now, if you want to simply target one of those 2 browsers in your style, you need to do 2 redundant lines, which will hopefully soon be 3 redundant lines, to do the exact same thing.
But they're not doing it the same.
Obviously, the rendering engine is slightly different.
The WebKit syntax isn't at all the same as most syntax. When you come to different corners,
Yep.
their syntax is different between WebKit and Mozilla and Chrome. Specifically, also Chrome and Mozilla is by standard, and WebKit is
Right. Like I said, I mean, there are a few things that are different. I see this one being used mostly because it probably makes the most sense. You can obviously also specify different corners. I didn't do it for the sake of brevity, but you can also specify how each corner is done. The language there changes a little between Mozilla and WebKit, let's say, whereas WebKit follows what will end up being the proper terminology used. Mozilla decided to go a little different. But as you see, everyone basically supports this except IE. Another one is we can do native border images, which is very nice. So we have this image here to begin with. And what we can do is we can say, here, I'll just move over here. Sorry? No? What we can specify is we first choose the image, and this will be so far what is the proposed standard way of doing it. And then if we look at these ones, they look very similar to this one, except for the prefix. But what we get to choose is basically how we're going to splice up our image. There's a lot of different options, so I chose to only give one example. We can obviously get into further in the discussion afterwards. But we can have it so that it's rounded to those dimensions. So we see here with my box, for instance, that it goes all the way around as most people would typically do. There's also an option to stretch it so the image is actually stretched throughout the entire box. Doesn't often look too nice, so I don't think too many people use that one. But it certainly is going to be a powerful module. The box shadow, which is another one I'm obviously very happy to see. We no longer need to be doing strange things with empty spans, divs, tables, anything. As you can see, basically, there's one way to implement it. It's supported by almost everyone. You can't tell with these colors, but basically we have here the three arguments being shown. We have the first one here being the horizontal spacing from the element. We have the next item here being the vertical, and they can obviously both positive or negatives, once again in pixels or EMs. And the third one here is going to actually be the blur. So for instance, the first box has a stronger blur, same as the second one. However, the third does not have anything, and even though it says red, it looks black. Moving on to text.
Can you just add a comment?
Yes.
I've had problems with box shadows, and there is a file for IT to use box shadow with. Sorry, I forgot the HTC file.
Right.
I use CSS3 HTC file.
Right.
But my side it had box.
Exactly.
Shadow mode.
Right. So I'm not going to be including anything like that because, in my opinion, those are all hacks. Sometimes people are forced to use them, but using an HTC file or anything like that, it shouldn't be used. Basically, if the browser's not going to support it without using some strange cryptic workaround, it just shouldn't be used, and we should use progressive enhancement. But this is true, and this is a big problem with box shadow because usually box shadow is quite visually important for a lot of people. You know, you want to make something really pop out and look like it's creating a shadow. You don't really want to come to terms with not getting to use it. Support for this will be introduced with IE9, as well with text shadow, which we're about to discuss. And hopefully the world will be a better place, just a little bit. But I do agree with you that it's a problem. And in that case, there are other workarounds that we can try to only employ when we're targeting IE. It's not great, and it's not maybe as graceful as it should be, but we're kind of stuck. Now, moving on with the text shadow, basically the exact same thing, except we're employing it on text. The first one here, I'm just creating a very simple shadow. It's not actually being used vertically or horizontally any different position than the text, and I'm just creating a blur. So you get this fancy effect. This one's almost now totally useless to include. However, if you see, you can use, once again, the commas like with the background image and specify a whole bunch. And this actually looks like fire. So just pretend it's fire. It's really impressive. So there's not much point in focusing on that one. As we were talking about earlier with font base, thankfully CSS3 has native ways to do it. The actual terminology here isn't necessarily the most suggested. There's a few different features we can throw in there to obviously offer specific formats for different browsers. But what we see here is the same text. The source code is the exact same. However, the class on this one is fancy. And I've used the fancy font here. And it looks pretty fancy. So, the nice thing about this, of course, is that unlike all different workarounds, as was just discussed, we can select it, we can do all different things to it. When you look at it with any different browser, any different medium, whatever, everything is exactly intact. Sorry?
You can get sued.
Well, of course, of course, your mileage may vary with that one, but you should be only using a text font that you, of course, have the license and the rights to use, and then how this is going to be really enforced in the future, I don't know. I don't think there's going to be a font task force who's going to scour the internet for illegally used fonts, but it's certainly a very valid concern. Many corporations as well, for instance, if they have a custom font type for their logo, they may not want to use it. You know, I'm sure some people wouldn't be happy with everyone embedding for free Helvetica on their website, you know, when you should be paying, you know, so many hundreds of dollars for it otherwise. Transformation is a whole category which concerns me a little. I'm going to explain. The transformation modules can do just that. They transform whatever elements you're specifying on. Some of these very greatly, in my opinion, infringe upon the behavior that is supposed to be set up for JavaScript. I can show you some of these at the end of the talk, but basically, some of them with WebKit is making the most progress by far in this field, if you want to call it progress. The problem is that with WebKit, you can now basically create a three-dimensional item. An element can be 3D, it can rotate, it can move all around your page. You can do the GeoCities JavaScript snowflakes falling down natively with CSS. For anyone who might have missed 1998, you can do all sorts of amazing, amazing things. And I don't lie, it's true, especially now with HTML5. I just recently saw Quake 2 embedded in a browser. I think Google announced this on their blog. For anyone who missed 1998. So obviously the power is there, but now we need to possibly start to reevaluate what is CSS going to be in charge of and what is JavaScript going to be in charge of. And in my personal opinion, I think CSS should stick to what it's really been defined as doing only visual things, not handling behavior, interaction. There are a few other problems with this, but just to first explain, the one that I do agree with, which is rotate, it's been on the screen for a while. I created a paragraph here within a little rounded circle I created. Shazam. I've just transformed it. Rotate 45 degrees. Obviously, both browsers, both vendors have implemented the exact same way. This is really quite unsupported, even within the W3C support. You look at the overview, they're not really talking about transforming. It's probably for this reason. Now, of course, you know, power to the people, everyone loves it. It's moving forward at a really, really fast pace because who doesn't like seeing Quake 2 in your browser? I don't think it's going to be stopped, so I'm not quite sure where that's really going to be taking things. Another problem is, let's say with the animation, there's one in animation here, and I'll show it to you at the end, is you could make this spin around. Now, if you're to make this spin around and you're using JavaScript, as far as I know, within the API, there's nothing to say where it's currently situated. So you could really start to create some problems. For instance, if you use JavaScript and you expect that at JavaScript, when it's angled at a perfect 90 degrees, you know, you're able to predict what it's supposed to look like, and suddenly you have no way of knowing where this spinning Shazam really is. I don't know too much about it, and personally I've avoided it for those reasons, but time will tell. Lastly, I just wanted to talk from the new modules before we move on to the next section here. Sorry, any questions? No? What I think is possibly more exciting... yes? I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question. Yes.
Where are you referencing that from? Are you using it part of the backplane, or is there really using it as
Yeah.
I'm just asking where the context for him mentioning stack comes from.
Basically what happened was when... basically in like 1998 and 2000, a lot of people who became really concerned with accessibility, mostly accessibility, were concerned about how different medium were taking a look at this page. For instance, with tables, as a good example. And when we're using tables to explain a whole...
I'm not asking about the difference between
Yes.
structure, presentation, content. I know tables is really a relationship tool. I'm asking the word stack.
Yes.
Who's using it?
I think basically, I don't know if it's officially coined amongst any of the powers that be beyond all of the most progressive web designers and developers out there who are really in charge of these sorts of things. And I think the word stack itself, it's not like it has a trademark. It's...
Stack means something a bit different than computer.
It does, yeah. I'm not talking like the TCP/IP stack or anything else.
In terms of standards and stuff like that, how are people using it? Where are you pulling this word from?
It's a term that basically since the early 2000s just kind of became really popular. You could say paradigm. I don't know if a lot of people really understand it.
Because the other thing is when you say JavaScript, it's intended to have this role of a stack, and I'm not sure exactly what you're referring to as a stack. JavaScript, I don't think, firstly, it's not a WT.
Right.
And I don't think it was, it's something that evolved as a very basic language.
Right.
It evolved because there were all these easy, snippets that you could just change, stick in your name here, and things would happen.
Right.
It wasn't designed to control behavior. Where would an X form fit in with what you're calling a stack when Java's responsible for behavior?
Well, basically we're going to be having new...
And who's deciding JavaScript is responsible for behavior?
When we look at what JavaScript is, being a client-side technology, a client-side technology, basically I think the point is that it's been boiled down to that it should be used for behavior in the sense that it should enhance a page.
I'm objecting to what it should. Because for the most part, JavaScript is. No one defined when you're making a backplane to the web. Well, let's put in JavaScript here because we want to enhance it.
Right.
It's something that was, it's there, now we press it. It's messy.
Right.
It shouldn't just be doing anything.
Right, but this is the truth.
Well, no, Xform is a much better solution for testing behavior. However, it's not adopted. JavaScript's put up because it's really easy for 12 years old. Copy this cute JavaScript from one of the, 1,000 JavaScript sites. Copy it onto their web page where it says enter your something here. They could do it, and they have.
No,
I'm
I understand what you're saying,
for what you're
but
saying. It sounds like it's something
well,
like a specification that was stacking.
I think the way that a lot of people are viewing it is that, even the W3C, almost everything it's ever offered has come out of a mess. And people have sorted out what it's best used for. Even PHP. PHP was terrible. Terrible, terrible, terrible. Some people love it, some people don't. But by the same token, especially now, let's say with how HTML5, we're going to talk about HTML5 for one moment, and it's not really the discussion here, but HTML5 also wasn't put forth by the W3C. It's now been adopted by it, but it was actually by a separate group altogether. And HTML5 is now going to be presenting a new way to be doing forms. There's HTML5 forms. Obviously, there's different parties who have different opinions. Some people think HTML5 is terrible. Some people think XHTML2 really should have been viewed. Some people really prefer feeding everything through, X forms in different ways. And so, me coming up here, I use the term should because I'm giving a lecture on how I think something should be done. Some people might say that you should still use tables because it'll for sure look the same in every browser. That's not to derail your opinion. I understand what you're saying. I think that there was probably a bit more logic behind JavaScript with where it came from than just, floating snowflakes and enter your name here and it'll show up on the page. There was more to it than just document writer, like simple animations, and I think that there was a lot involved, and it really tried to mimic other languages in its potential. I think what really slowed it down was, and I avoided JavaScript for many years, was that it was just useless with the technology we had. Browsers and web applications and other things, they were just lacking. So basically, it got a very bad name for doing these really cheesy animations and not being used properly, not being embraced. So I think what's happening here is different people, Jonathan Snook, Mayer, like we said, Zeldman, different people who've been involved very closely with not only W3C, but really embracing these technologies and helping mold them with speeches and actually contributing right to these specs as they were being developed, really started to see that just like CSS1 was originally created for presentation, although in a very limited scope, it needed to be embraced and really pushed forward. And it made a lot of sense in a semantic web situation because you could have your meaning only like a book without any pictures. And then if you want to have pictures, it really, the author is not typewriting in the picture. And it's being, brought in through a presentation level. It's something else. We could get into it, and I don't know how much time I have to get into it. And I'd be happy to discuss it further. Right. Right. Okay. I understand. I don't know if also if everyone else who also says the other thing is necessarily wrong. Maybe it's a very valid argument both ways. Okay. So, in all fairness, I'll avoid the word stack. It has been a commonly maybe misused term. It sounds great because a lot of the people who do these things aren't coming from back-end languages, server-side languages. So, any hardcore programming, etc., a lot of it's not really found on them. So, we'll use paradigm. Okay. 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 I almost skipped the screen. I haven't actually explained it yet. I'm not sure how many people are actually using attribute selectors already, if ever.
Yes.
3, 4 on this side. 5.
When we stop supporting I6?
You should stop supporting it now. I'll get to that in a moment. There's a few more here introduced. They probably should have been in the first place, and they're just simply overlooked. The functionality really isn't any different than the other selectors we already had. You'll still notice there's no way to go up. There's no way for us to style anything above something. We can't say for any paragraph that has the class, let's say, disclaimer, we should style the header above that paragraph a certain way. We have no way of doing that. And obviously, with Foresight, you can go in and you can change the markup to do what you want. Or you can employ, let's say, JavaScript for whatever its original intentions may have been to traverse the DOM and then put in the class or whatever. However, it is mine and some other people's opinions that JavaScript should not be used in that way. Here's some of our new elements that aren't just simply attribute selectors, but the actual element selectors. I think for the most part, it basically explains itself. There are a few that are rather interesting here. First of all is selection. I'm going to go from the bottom up. Selection, which is allowing anyone to really style that little blue color you get when you select text. You can change the color of the background and the text color, I think. You can't change borders and a few other things. Maybe useful to a small degree. We have some new selectors which are going to be very helpful for styling forms. We also have here root. Now root seems a little strange because for the time being, basically it's always going to result in HTML because it's the root of the document. I don't know what plans they have for it because even with HTML5, you still have to specify a root of HTML.
It can be used for XML.
Sorry?
It can be used for XML.
Okay, that's true. So you can use for XML. Also, everyone else but I really supports this. So we're going to just look at, an example I created when I spoke with Mr. Silla. We came up with the idea that I could create a very simple page and present what I consider the paradigm of what web design should be, with showing markup, with some basic styling, and then progressive enhancement. And some of this, I think, is overlapping some of what has already been talked about. But I'm going to have a working example to show you. And at any point, if someone actually wants me to break into looking at the source, I can, if it's exciting. So just moving on here. First thing we have, made a little fake website. I don't actually speak warm some. For my wife, Anya. She's a wonderful interior designer, if anyone's interested. When you look at a website, you're following the paradigm of behavior, JavaScript, presentation, CSS, content, HTML. A website should still be meaningful, as I was explaining. So this is a version of the website. This isn't done. This isn't how it's going to go live. This is just simply without any CSS whatsoever. So as we see here, it's meaningful. We have our navigation up at the top. Some people maybe think that's not appropriate. I used a few things here to create some links, which we're going to get a chance to use and style later with our new advanced selectors. For right now, nothing exciting. I'll just scroll down for a moment. That's not my mouse. Okay, this is my mouse. At the very bottom, we have a table for tabular data. Once again, not that exciting. Some fake prices for some fake packages. Now, once we want to start styling, I'm very much of the school that since every browser, let's say every engine, has some default styling attributes, it's always a good idea to employ a reset. Some people feel different ways about this, but I work with one here. I've created this using HTML5, so when you look at it, if we do look at the source code, you might notice some strange elements that aren't very familiar to everyone. But once we apply the CSS reset, it looks not so exciting. Very, very simple. Everything's now lost its padding. It has specified. Everything's the same size. It's very dull. And the only point to doing this is that now we know for sure that everything is done the exact same way. And so now when we want to restyle this, we have the predictability of knowing how every other browser should render this. Because now every browser, no matter who looks at this one page, is going to look at it the exact same way. So first we created some really simple styling here. This is just using, I think the most was CSS level 2, maybe 2.1. For most of the styling, we have here some colors. They don't look quite right on there, but that's okay. You can see when we hover over certain things, they do things like become highlighted. Scrolling down, we see our table here. If you see, we basically have a very common, very boring blogging, sort of looking site here. Everything's one column with headers and paragraphs. In the very bottom, we have our table, little padding on it. Not that, oh, you can see it. There's some borders and a footer. Now, let's say in a live situation, someone wants to go to the website once it's been enhanced. This is as much as they're going to see if it doesn't support what we've enhanced it with. So for instance, the IE here could be not transparent this time. It could actually be quite opaque. It would support this, which is good. It's not that exciting. It looks quite dull. And the whole point of me showing this was that when I spoke with Mr. Silla, I informed him that I wanted to try to just create something very quickly without any images whatsoever, just to create something quite simple, however somewhat elegant looking, using just CSS3. So if we move on, I've now enhanced it with CSS3. So what we've done is we've introduced a few things, just starting with the header. Obviously, the first thing you're going to see is there's a different font, using font face. We've taken our little slogan here, and we've made it look sort of like a post-it or a sticker. We've used transform in a way that I personally find agreeable. We've done some borders and some drop shadows around the borders and whatnot to make the navigation now look somewhat three-dimensional and just at least more visually exciting. On the very side? Are you referring to this here? Yeah, it's just style. Basically, I just did that border lighter than the other borders. You know, so the top border. No, it's just the regular border. I just specified a different border color for each border. So border top was 1 pixel solid white. Right. So basically, no, what you're actually seeing is the double is actually a drop shadow beneath it. Okay. So we have the drop shadow, and so now it looks a little bit more exciting. You know, it's not great. Don't know how much I'd really promote it as is like this, but the point is that we now have a gradient here. We have our new fonts with a very subtle drop shadow to sort of, one of the things you might notice is that when you start to employ your own custom fonts, sometimes certain browsers, they look a little jagged. In fact, most seem to have all different ways of rendering them nicely and whatnot. So sometimes it's really nice to just simply do a very subtle drop shadow because it usually helps anti-alias the actual text. Now, the other thing we're going to see here is that when you go down, I will say here also you might notice the radial gradient. So, going down a little here, we're just going to just take a note here that this paragraph, which once used to be a very long paragraph, is being styled with the selector I haven't shown, which is going to be the CSS columns. You have the ability on different elements, usually it's going to be on paragraphs and whatnot, to show or to specify if it should be split up amongst columns. So you can specify the column width, a gutter, otherwise padding here. You can also do a border that will show up. So I've just simply done two columns. There's a WebKit and a Firefox implementation of this. I don't think anyone else has it. Maybe Opera. And I'm saying this a lot. I don't know who I'm skipping. But it's nice. It's nice because you could create something very much like a newspaper design, and you have a fairly reliable fallback that it's just a paragraph, and it will still show as just a regular paragraph. It might not be as exciting, but that's about it. You can also create something that will span as many columns as you create. That's a bit more than we're going to get into right now, though. If we go down, we're just going to see, at this resolution you can't tell, but I have a very subtle gradient on the background, which helps it pop out a little. You know, all the typical CSS3 goodies here, rounded borders, drop shadows, whatnot. This particular row is being styled by the attribute selector, the element selector of choosing the third of type LI, which was one of the ones we had just looked at a few screens back. It's really hard, I think, to give a really good working example amidst everything else I've talked about already of the power of the selectors, because you can do so many, and there's so many different ones that I could be here for an hour showing you probably not very exciting things like suddenly that word's highlighted and suddenly that word has a border. The point is that now we have many ways to do different things. One great thing, for instance, is if we have a list of, let's say we're using a list as a navigation item, and every list item has a bottom border of 1 pixel. And you don't want the very last LI, the list item, to have that border because it conflicts with the design. Before, you used to have to do some way, whether it was backend or JavaScript or whatever, to give it the class of some sort of way of detecting that and changing that one style. The nice thing is that we can do it natively this way. Of course, you could usually do things as well, like last child, etc. But the point here is that support, by and large, has become much more accepted, not only for CSS 2.1 selectors, but now we have more additionally powerful ones as well. I think that was basically with the working example that I wanted to show you. So was there any questions with this before I move on?
Can you select the text on at the top?
Yeah, you can actually. Yeah. Now, I should point out that there's a few things I did notice when making this with rendering engines, and it's a glitch I haven't had a chance to really ask anyone else if they experienced. This was originally rounded, sort of like my Shazam example. And I would notice that when I rotated it, in any browser I tried that even knew what I was talking about, would create some strange little like orange pixely weird glitch on the side when it was being rotated. I haven't had a chance to really look into what that is or why it's there. I don't even think everyone's experiencing it. I don't really know. Maybe it's me. Maybe it doesn't like Olim.
Maybe it's a Windows 7 Easter egg.
Maybe. Maybe Windows 7 is infecting all the other browsers, and it'll be the first one to not have this. I don't know. So yeah, was there any other questions about this? No? Yes? No? No? Okay. So I'm just going to close these here. Okay. Moving on, we have our examples in the wild. I just want to give a disclaimer first that I personally feel that while some of these are absolutely amazing in accomplishments and technology, etc., I don't necessarily condone what they're all doing. Some of them start to border in what I feel should be handled by other technologies like JavaScript, but they are interesting nonetheless, so we'll just quickly load some up and show them here. Just going to load them all up at once. Okay, now, I don't have an internet connection. There's Wi-Fi here, yeah? I don't need any sort of key or anything?
No, it's open.
Okay. That was an unforeseen event there. Just give me 1 second. Which one are we looking at? I guess this one here? Okay. Let's try this again. So the first one here, we have some elastic thumbs. It's a fast connection here, right? Okay. This is very nifty. We typically see this being done with JavaScript, or some people even use Flash, which I am personally not a fan of. But we can see that we can rather fluidly or elastically, if that's a word, expand these all and really start to mock, let's say, the OS dock, OS X dock here. Maybe that's quickly. Okay, you didn't see anything. So here's another example. Using only transformers, we've now managed to simulate something three-dimensional. So we can take a look at it. We have our embedded buttons just to show that these actually are HTML things we're looking at. I'm not lying with any of this. This is all real. This is a photograph. It's pretty amazing. I personally don't feel this is all what CSS should be focusing on, but it's pretty amazing. And obviously, with CSS not being fully established, CSS3 not being fully established yet, we don't really know where it's going. It's very possible that CSS3 will become something very different than it is right now. We have also the ability to basically simulate modals right in the browser. I'll show that one. This is all just using CSS. The only JavaScript here, as we can see, is being used to dismiss the OK button, or being used to close this here. This is not being powered whatsoever by. There we go. And this one comes down from the top. So we can see the actual syntax being used. Okay, we have different easing styles and functions. You'll notice these are all WebKit, which is why I'm making this presentation using a WebKit engine, because it would be slightly less exciting otherwise. And we're just going to go to a few more here. Here's another one, only CSS, just creating some Polaroid styles that'll sort of give focus over other items and pop out. I'm sorry? You can choose the speeds and everything. Yeah, with the transform module, there's different things. You can choose different easing styles. You can choose different speeds. We're going to see some other examples here which just show the power of the actual animation as opposed to just things sort of popping out. So we have here, as I said, someone trying to reproduce the OS X dock using only CSS, and lucky us, we can see the code right there. Once again, everything's WebKit. There might be some more focus on other browsers, but right now everyone else is basically staying away except WebKit from being able to do all of these. Now this one I do actually, in various ways, agree with what it's doing. Basically, it's using some transforms and whatnot to style what maybe were divs to be these vertical cards. It's also using the transform rotate to rotate them. As of right now, I personally feel that this is very usable and sensible to see, as up until this point we've seen CSS being used. However, we can also do other things. And actually, if you look here, you might see this. Do you see that little pixel there? This is what I was talking about. And there's one there. I don't quite know what that's about yet. I have to admit ignorance on that one. But this is all text. This is all CSS and HTML. No JavaScript. Here's something as well that is typically being reserved for JavaScript is the ability to do different hovers. We have image background, background image. We can specify the sizes and animating those. We have opacities. I have no interest in transformers per se, but it is pretty unique. Okay, that was that particular page. I just had a few more to end with here that I wanted to quickly talk about that are also quite interesting. Some of these are even more powerful and interesting than the ones we just saw, to continue using the word interesting. So we have a pure CSS Coke can. This Coke can was made only using CSS. So next time you drink a can of Coke, just take a look for the markup. We have, if you scroll, it looks, without hitting the right mouse button, we have what looks like a rolling three-dimensional item. And what it's actually doing is with using a series of images and offsets, we've managed to create a rather clever way of doing what... I'm sorry? It's scrolling in the background, yeah. But it's also, while it's doing it, is rotating this can, as you can see. So we do have some different tricks here, like darker images here to simulate the 3D effect. Pretty neat. Here's another one that's quite interesting. Using only CSS3, we can start to create some 3D environments. Each one of these images, I should point out, is it's been sliced up into multiple images, and so as we move over the box, it's being transformed or skewed. And it's a neat little 2-second toy. Okay, now here's something we can do natively now in CSS3. We can simply open these up. We don't need to do this accordion any longer in JavaScript. We have the ability to just do it right here. That's pretty cool for a lot of people. That's wonderful. A lot of people hate implementing, let's say, JavaScript into an entire site that only does that, and there's no need for it otherwise. So, it's obviously very interesting for them. Of course, the support itself isn't that great, as we see here. Supports Target. However, obviously, the WebKit is allowing it to have the animated slide effect, whereas, let's say, Firefox simply opens up the content following it. Still usable, still progressive enhancement. Now, this one I think is probably going to be quite interesting for many people as well. This one is showing a few different things at once. Obviously, we have different skews and rotates here to create what looks like 3 boxes, and we also have animation when you hover over each one. And all of this text is selectable. So next time you have a client who wants a website, just put it on 3 boxes. Do that. 3 different websites. You can look at 3 different stores online at the same time. I don't know. It's a great little toy. It looks quite interesting. Using animation, here's an entirely CSS-powered clock. The only thing JavaScript is doing right here was grabbing the time from the browser, and it's being animated only using CSS3. That's pretty neat. I have to say that one, maybe not as visually, exciting as some of the other ones, but I think it's quite fascinating. So after our examples we have here, that basically brings me to the end of my presentation. I have a few recommended reads. Anyone who wants to get seriously involved in CSS3 really should check out the roadmap. Some really great websites here. We have CSS3.info, probably the premier website trying to give out as much information to designers as possible. CSS3 Please is a fairly interesting sandbox type website where you can actually see the changes to the CSS you're making on the website. Does that explain it? Should I open it up? Does it make sense? No? That was really vague. Yeah? I missed your presentation, I'm sorry. Okay. So CSS Desk, just skipping down, is basically the same thing, except it gives you nothing to start with. So you can really, on the one side of the page, just do whatever you want. I saw this one actually just before I came here. Can I Use is a very important reference where you can basically check out all sorts of criteria of what we want to use, whether it's HTML5 items, whether it's CSS3, CSS 2.1, all different things, and it'll tell you what browsers, specific versions, vendors, etc., which ones support it, if it renders it as being okay to use in production right now, and we'll even give you examples. So that is a fantastic reference. Matt Wilcox, this is a very interesting article as well to read. I'll just leave it up there. This is obviously not going to be, since it's not using a presentation software, it's not going to be uploaded to SlideShare. I might find a way to do that afterwards. But if anyone is interested in getting any of these links or asking for any other information, they can email me. Or if you're quick at writing, you can just write it down very quickly. So basically, the final notes I just want to give you before I'm done is that CSS3 is a collection of modules, something important to keep in mind. It's really no longer the way anything used to be. Things are really changing. CSS3 is still in the works. It's going to be for quite a while, a long while. But it can be used now, as long as you're careful with what you're doing. As you can see with that next point, I got ahead of myself. It can be used in production now. In mine and many other people's opinions, really depending on what you want to do. Obviously, as pointed out, if you have a website that's very much focused on a box shadow in the center column or whatever, and it's an online e-commerce store and you're targeting business folk who might be using IE4, you probably don't want to use CSS3. IE7, yeah. Right. So for instance, with IE7, I would say that IE7, I don't hate it. IE6, I don't care for. IE7, obviously, is much better. And so I'm happy when someone mentions 7 instead of 6 as a requirement. With 7, sometimes what you need to do is you need to outweigh your market share, et cetera, who's really visiting. If you have a lot of people visiting IE7 and something as noticeable as a rounded background, a div with shadows everywhere, and whatnot, obviously you probably wouldn't want to use CSS3 there. However, you still can use it in other places. You can use it to style a form more appropriately or do other things. Even use some of its selectors for things that don't really matter if you can't see, but are nice to see if you can.
Well, we use different code for IE and for other browsers, and then when the IE code broke, at some point the client gave up and said, okay, just make it gray.
Right.
Don't do it shadow, just make it gray, and we can do that for IE only.
Right.
But we use proper code for other browsers.
And in many cases, sometimes you just have to let IE take the hit. And some people are absolutely not interested in that. And that's the reality of what we do as a whole. I would like to point out, since you had mentioned this, that I am very strongly against browser detection for the most part. Using browser detection, obviously, with JavaScript, a lot of people automatically say you shouldn't do, but it's not really any different than using browser detection with, client-side or server-side scripting. There can still be problems, and a lot of people are using something very simple with browser detection to simply do a notice of IE6 is dead, and support is stopping. Right, exactly.
No other choice, so I had an IE.css that just basically.
Right, right. So.
IE.css has 3 or 4 lines on the whole website.
Yeah, IE is. I think if there was, amongst all of the different discussions and workshops worldwide about web standards, web design, web technologies, and if you could make a huge tag pool of every word that's said, IE6 would be like huge. And it becomes really difficult. Should be a little bit smaller, floating next to it. The thing is everyone has a different opinion. Some people are very much advocates of the idea that we need to support everything no matter whatever. And you could just use a table website, whatever. I'm very much not against that because sometimes you need to acknowledge what's broken. That doesn't mean that the user needs to suffer. With progressive enhancement, or what are some of the other words I've heard? Graceful degradation, progressive degrahensment. I understand. IE9, from what I've heard, right. IE8 is not such a big offender. IE7 also. The way I view IE7 is I create a website with, I'm sorry. I've basically focused on the important browsers, and I take a look obviously at IE7, IE8, and as long as you're creating websites from the get-go with the right methodologies, it's usually going to look okay. certain things, like you said, if they're important, you have no choice. And that's what you need to do. So yes, you're very much correct there. Just important to keep in mind the vendor prefix. Learning to say farewell to IE6. Is it even supported anymore officially? No, it's totally gone, yeah? It's not gone yet. It's there. The Grim Reaper is... Yeah.
Something this has been, we have had discussions about that on the forum, and the solution that I like best is support IE, make the client pay more, so you're gonna work.
That's certainly a very good option.
I can support IE6, you'll have to pay 1,000 more shekels for it.
There you go. Obviously, IE7, see above. To wrap up, thank you for listening, and thank you very much to